Of course, being Canadian researchers, we start by looking at ourselves. And one of the things that we have found is that and it seems like a fairly obvious statement to make, but it's one that's very true. The more you know about IT, the more you know about IT today, the better you are as a manager, the better you are as a director, no matter your role. And so what it says is, what is your level of savviness, IT savviness? And so we've identified a construct called IT savviness that expresses this notion of personal competence with regards to IT, I think, very elegantly. Savviness is basically an awareness, access to, the ability to analyze and communicate about information systems in business terms. So it's one thing for your CIO, for example, to stand up in front of you and say, here's how this customer relationship management system is going to lead to higher customer retention, one of our business goals. It's quite another for you to turn around and explain the same thing in words that you understand as a non-IT manager. And so it's that awareness, that shrewd judgment that you have about IT. And Michael, going back to your earlier point, is that shrewd judgment that's not grounded in an experience that's 10, 15, 20 years old. It's that shrewd judgment today in 2010. You know, one example that immediately comes to mind is social media. Right? Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Right? Social media is exploding, and most organizations don't understand it. Sometimes at their peril. And so the two questions that we have is number one, have I taken any kind of training in the last 2 years? Right? The life cycle of technology is roughly 18 months. And so that means that for all those of you that did your MBAs at Ivy, everything you learned about IS is now obsolete. And so we encourage you to come back for refresher courses. No, it basically says that, 18 months is about the life cycle of technology, and so every 2 years we get something new. And I'm not talking about the newest chip, but I'm talking about ways in which people do things. And so, for example, I would throw out as one contemporary condition is the iPad. Does the iPad make sense? Do you have an opinion on it? You probably do. You've probably read a lot about it. Right? Most of you will probably not buy an iPad. You're not the target demographic. And yet, the iPad may very well change computing, the way that we understand it. Or it may not. So the first question is, have you taken any kind of a grade or refresher training with regards to information technology? And 2 years is about the recommended cycle. Second thing is, if you're not going to take upgrade, read. Read. By the way, Amelia will make these slides available to you tomorrow, so you don't need to bother copying these links down. But here are 4 places I think you can go to get more information about the world of technology. I've chosen them because they are accessible. I especially like Bob Cringely and Walt Mossberg. They're very approachable writers. They write in English, not in geek. And they have a lot of information. I especially like Mossberg because he writes about personal technology. And if you understand, for example, how your iPhone works, then you understand how the multi-billion-dollar information system in your bank works. You really do. Because the principles are the same. The scale is vastly different, but the operating principles are the same, because at the root of it all, and this is the beauty of computer science, it's all ones and zeros. It's all bits. Right? And at the end of the day, if we're throwing bits around, it doesn't matter if they're word bits, it doesn't matter if they're number bits, it doesn't matter if they're money bits, video bits, audio bits, it doesn't matter. They're all bits. They're all bits. And so if you understand how your iPhone works, you understand how a bank works. So the question is, how do you make that leap? And reading is one of the ways to do that. So going back to the dashboard, if you do both, good on you. I'll tell you right now, in the surveys of directors that we did, the majority of them did neither. Okay, the majority of them did neither. And so they were mired back in this model of, I came to information technology in the day of mainframe computers, that were in an air-conditioned room with an elevated floor and an arcane priesthood in white lab coats managing it. Michael?
Isn't it easy with so much information out there to just find something that supports your idea?
Yeah.
I mean, I do, unfortunately, read this stuff all day long.
Yeah.
But if I have a certain philosophy, I can back my, I can find somebody to back it up on the web or on, some white paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I feel it's really just, their opinion coming forth. Maybe that's the reason that they don't even do it, because it's easy to get information to back yourself up for whatever
But I'll-
these days.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a couple of things though, okay? First, there's reading 10 different things, and then there's reading the same thing 10 times. Okay. And that's the difference, you know, when I talk about IT savviness, that shrewd judgment is predicated on looking at disconfirmatory information as much as confirmatory information, and developing the ability to distinguish between the two. Second thing that happens though, you know, and I've seen this on boards, if you've got a board of 12, 13, 14 directors, 9 directors, and if all of them are doing this, you will not get a unanimous and universal opinion across all 12 or 13 or 9 of them. And so it's that difference of opinion that leads to dialogue that's important. So to me, you're absolutely right in what you say,
If
right?
a board member if they're engaged and are
Yeah.
prepared to, you know, bring differences of opinion or
Mhm.
ask the right questions,
Yeah.
true.
And
Tough
to
in
me,
IT
that's-
because,
yeah.
again, typically the board members are, you know, have this glazed look over their eyes.
They do.
Anytime the IT topic comes up.
As soon as you can remove that glazed look and engage them in a dialogue,
Yeah.
that to me, so this is a catalyst, I think, for a process rather than an outcome in and of itself. In terms of the second one, infrastructure risk, we're back to this notion of fit, right? And the two questions, you know, deal with this idea of strategic fit. Has management shown IT strategic fit in the organization? And what do I mean more specifically by that? IT strategy operates at 3 different levels in the organization, at the operational, at the tactical, and at the strategic level. At the operational level, this is the CIO and his or her organization. How many programmers do I have, if any? What's my outsourcing budget? What do I outsource? How much do I pay for it? What do I insource? How much do I pay for it? Just like every other manager in the organization has a set of resources that they need to allocate, that's got absolutely nothing to do with the board. And if your CIO can't do that, then they shouldn't be a CIO, just like a CFO shouldn't be a CFO if they can't organize their human and financial and material resources. Tactically becomes more important because tactically you're looking at IS across the organization. And IS is a beautiful function, more than any other, I think. It really spans the boundary of the organization. I mean, so do human resources, so does finance, but they look at the world from a different point of view. In IS, you're looking at it from an operational point of view. And so to the extent that you are seamless across the organization and providing that support function for all business processes becomes an important metric of fit. The third is between the organization and its competitive environment. And so are we not only efficient, but are we effective? And so does our strategy make sense? And to the extent that our strategy makes sense, to what extent do our information systems deliver on that strategy? And so demonstrating strategic fit, to me, for management, is to demonstrate it at those 2 levels, the tactical and strategic levels. And that's a lesson that repeatedly needs to be hammered to the board. Second question is, does an architecture plan exist? And I use the word architecture deliberately. Those of you that are in IT right now will tell me there is no such thing as an architecture. No, there isn't. You're absolutely right. Because, you know, an information system has hardware, it's got software, it's got data. Each one of these things has its own architecture. There is a hardware architecture, there is a data architecture. Each one of them wrapped together makes this meta-architecture that we call architecture. And so architecture is one of these buzzwords in IT, you know, and this is a little watchword. When a CIO says architecture, odds are they're probably trying to buy some time. They're thinking. That's just a placeholder that says, I will throw the architecture and Michael, the glazed looks will come up, okay? And then I can buy time to get myself out of whatever trouble I've been into. But again, have we demonstrated a plan? And especially today, to what extent are we dealing on a policy level with offshoring or outsourcing? Because most organizations outsource a significant component of their IT, and so the question becomes, what components are you outsourcing and why? And the suggestion would be, if it is core competence, you don't outsource it. Offshoring also has its own attendant risks, and so there are risks that are quantifiable as well as unquantifiable risks to offshoring, and so that also needs to be addressed in the strategic plan as presented to the board. Again, red, yellow, or red, amber, and green for yeses or no to 1, 2, or both questions, or no questions. IT project risk, very, very briefly, deals with the whole discipline of project management. Generally speaking, when we talk about IT risk, right, there are three broad factors that affect the riskiness of an IT project. One is the size of the project itself. If it's a big project, if it spans across all functions in the organization, if it's a multi-million, multi-year, multi-operational period project, it is risky. The second, and this relates back to our first factor on IT competence, deals with the knowledge about information technology in the organization. The more your people who have absolutely nothing to do with information technology know about information technology, the better an organization you will be at adopting those new information technologies. The third risk factor deals with structural risk. There is a discipline out there called project management. There's a project management book of knowledge. There is a certification program for project managers. How much of that is embedded in your organization really matters. An IT project risk basically asks the question, how many project managers do we have? And then the second thing, going back to the statement I made earlier of the fact that success breeds on itself. It's absolutely remarkable to go into an organization and take a look at 10, 15, or 20 years worth of IT projects. And the rate at which organizations succeed in implementing new information technologies tends to stay the same, absent a shock like establishing a project management office. And so what it says is that organizations that are successful tend to breed success at IT. Those that are not tend not to, barring again a major shock or adjustment to the system. And so yes or no to both of those questions. Business continuity has become especially salient over the last couple of years as we've had to deal with shocks that most of us never expected and we're certainly not equipped to deal with. And so business continuity deals with enterprise risk management, which is also a discipline unto itself. And so the first question is there an enterprise risk framework in place in this organization? And there are a number of frameworks available. Some are industry specific, some are more general, some are legislatively mandated depending on your jurisdiction. But is there an enterprise risk register? Is there an enterprise risk framework in place in this organization or not? Step one. Step two is if I had $1 for every time I went into an organization and I asked, do you have an enterprise risk framework? And they said, we certainly do. And I said, do you have a disaster recovery plan? And they said, we certainly do. Show me. Oh, hang on a second. We've got to go way back into the deepest, darkest recess of our warehouse. And there's an old bookcase there where all documents go to die. And on that bookcase, in the furthest shelf away from it, covered in about 8 inches of dust, is our emergency plan. Or something like that. I exaggerate for the sake of drama, but the point is, question number 2, is have you ever tried it? Have you ever tried it? I love going into a large organization and asking the CIO, have you just, for the fun of it, thrown a bucket of water on that server right over there, or unplugged it, or taken it off the rack and just smashed it to bits, and then tried to recover from your offsite? And most CIOs will say, God no, I'd never do that. We have practice shutdowns. We will practice shutting it down, and we'll shut it down very, very, very carefully, and then we'll very carefully back it up while keeping this one live just in case. But throw water on it? Are you insane? Are you crazy? Why on earth would I do that? Well, because that's what happens when systems go bad. That's what happens when you have a flood. That's what happens when you have a fire. And so most organizations don't practice that sort of thing either. And so the second question deals with an IT disaster. Have you done penetration tests to test your security? Have you done audits? Have you had an actual IT disaster and tried to recover from it? Again, surprising how many organizations don't do full bore tests when they have mission critical systems. So yes or no again on both those questions. The final area deals with one again that's emerged over the last decade, especially with concerns over the protection of privacy and information and security of information, personal information. And I go back to the TJX example. TJX had to settle out of court a couple of lawsuits, customer lawsuits. They spent millions of dollars trying to assure their customers that their data had not been compromised and that their identities had not been stolen, and although in some cases they had. And so information risk deals with privacy concerns and asks the question, first of all, is this important enough as an organization to be on your radar screen? And by that we mean, do you have a privacy officer, a senior manager, right, not just the third clerk in shipping and receiving, but a senior officer that has explicit authority and responsibility for privacy issues in the organization? And number two, do we have policies and procedures in place that detail exactly what we do with information and how we do it? One of the pieces of study that one of my students did in the past is he took a look at the top 50 transactional websites on the web. This was a few years ago, and he looked explicitly at their security and privacy policies, and he wanted to know, what do the privacy policies say? On the whole, for those top 50 websites, most of the privacy policies, and by that I meant, what can we do with your information once you give it to us? Your name, your age, your address, your driver's license number, if that's what we ask you for. What can we do with this? And the general statement was, anything we want. We can resell it, we can box it up and ship it to somebody else, we can use it to sell you more things, we can use it to understand your buying patterns if you go to multiple sites, we can share it with other sites without your prior approval or permission. And you agree to this because you have decided to transact with us. And so most of us, when it comes into this whole big privacy statement, right, the time between the policy statement appearing on your screen and you clicking I agree is probably measured in nanoseconds. Right? Nobody reads those things. But if you bother reading them, you'll find that in fact the policies are there. And so the question becomes, how do you protect yourself? So, let me finish with two comments. One, these would be my top 10 red flags. And I won't read them to you, and as I say, Amelia, you'll make those available to people. But at the end of the day, consider this your own checklist. If you see, I say, 5 or more of these things happening in your organization, I would suggest that you need to do some work in terms of IT oversight, certainly at the board level and at the senior management level. 8 or more, you're a disaster waiting to happen. It's that simple. Okay? Under 5, you're starting towards the side of goodness. And so, as much as possible, you should aspire to having none of these. One of the things that I'm going to suggest you do is in terms of getting IT onto the board agenda. Best case scenario is have a lead director. Typically, legislation or regulation forces us to recruit for financial ability, and this is why a lot of accountants become board members for very good reasons, and or regulatory ability, which is why a lot of lawyers become board members as well. If you can incent one of these directors into becoming your lead director on IT issues, I think that would be a good thing. That would be the best possible thing. Ideally, that person should also be sitting on the audit committee of the organization, the audit committee of the board, and they become your go-to person for IT issues. Barring that, I think two things need to be done as well. IT strategy needs to be explicitly included in the board's annual strategy planning meeting. Boards will typically take 1, 2, sometimes 3 days to go over the strategic plan of the organization and to provide advice back to management on it and to provide modification. Make sure that IT strategy is explicitly included in that. And again, IT strategy not in terms of the boxes, but in terms of how information technology will enact the objectives of the organization. And number 2, I would suggest to you that you might want, the more you fall into that strategic side of the IS strategic grid. In other words, the more important new IT is to your organization, the more important it is to have the CIO appear before the board and report basically on 3 things. What is the status of every, I put strategic IT project there, but I'll say business project that involves IT. Which ones are late and why, and what are we doing about it? And number 3, what am I looking for? Because as part of my job, I do environmental scanning. What am I out there looking at? And it's a report that would take 3 to 5 minutes, but also keeps that awareness at the board. And Michael, back to your point, it's not so much what is said, is the fact that it is said. It's the process that's important, not so much the content. So that's all I have for now, and I'd love if you have any questions or comments or reactions to this. Yes?
You mentioned that the board spends too little time on strategic issues. But the board meets 3 or 4 times a year.
Yep.
And strategy goes on for years. So what is there so much to discuss on strategic issues?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I mean the general question is that what is a board? I mean, who is it? Irving Olds, I think, said it nicely. He was the chairman of U.S. Steel back in the 1960s, And his comment on directors is that they're like fish on parsley, decorative but useless. And if you adopt that perspective, you're right. What can a board do one day every quarter? The average director, though, doesn't spend just that one day, because that would be about 30, 35 hours a year. Average director spends about 200 hours. And so the question becomes, what do you do with those other 165 hours? If you've got a director that's industry specific, for example, that's spent 30, 40 years, or an ex-chair or an ex-CEO of your company or in your industry, is that person mentoring the CEO? Because a big part of the board's job is mentoring senior management. Is that person involved in succession planning? Is that person involved in understanding what the business is all about and providing advice based on their experience? And so to me, the board meeting is the outcome of all of those things that are done, and so it depends really on director involvement. And you're right, if you limit the director's involvement to those quarterly meetings, you're not going to get a lot out of your board. If you engage them in other ways and in other venues, then you will get a lot more out of them. And I'm presuming that you've gone to a lot of time, energy, and effort to recruit those directors, that the cost of maintaining that board is not inconsiderable, and so therefore I would respectfully ask, what are you getting from your investment? And it is just a bunch of old people sitting down and falling asleep for 8 hours a day, 4 times a year.
Just to meet the stock exchange.
Yeah, it's to meet the listing requirements, then you're not getting a lot out of your investment, and my suggestion would be that you could get a lot more.
I'd like to add something to what you said about casting in cement thoughts and board members I have. But I think of lately, one trend which I've been noticing a lot now, suddenly everybody is an IT expert. So the 10 directors or 10 senior management, they know how to use a certain technology at home, and suddenly they become the expert for the enterprise. Yeah. And it becomes a hard battle to fight sometimes, because at the end of the day, power kicks in somewhere or the other. Being I'm the director, I'll tell you what to do.
Right.
How do we deal with such situations? Because even though you lay out, look, at the end, yes, you are the director, you are going to make the decision, but this is what we need to jump into with our eyes open. So, any thoughts?
Yeah,
because it's something which I'm seeing happening a lot lately.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question, and it certainly doesn't help you when somebody stands up in a room and says, if you understand your iPhone, you understand your enterprise system. So I accept that, and that's perhaps a dangerous thing to say, but I'll tell you what, I will take that reaction over the glazed eyes any day. So to me, then, the challenge is to,
convince them.
Yeah, and show them. And I would ask something as simple as, take them into an IT group meeting and show them the complexity. Show them, grab the entity relationship diagram for your latest enterprise system implementation and show it to them and read it to them in English. And then say to them, you go home and read John Grisham, I go home and read this. And here's what this tells me. It's not hard to demonstrate complexity. And to me, it's not hard to do so in a rhetorically convincing manner. If they're at least approaching you from the perspective of, I know all about this, then at least it says they want to be challenged. And if you can do so in a constructive manner by showing them, not telling them. Because you're right, if you tell them, then power will come in and they'll say, you're wrong, I'm right, I'm the director, you're not. But if you show them, that to me is, when Herb Kelleher became CEO of Southwest, the first thing he did is he worked the galley, right? He worked the cabin, right? And he trained as an attendant, just enough to do it. Why? Because that's, those were his customers. And he needed to understand the customer experience in order to understand how to run that airline. And so, showing them the complexity is something that's remarkably easy to do. And showing them the difference between their iPhone and the enterprise system, I think is something that you can do. So that's what I would suggest is, and then it goes back to your question, sir, too. The more you can engage them, right? There's involvement, there's engagement. The more you can engage your directors and not see them as these benign oracles at the top of Mount Zeus that send these pronouncements down, the more you can engage them in a dialogue, the more value they will give you. And if they're not giving you that value, then I would also say you need new directors. It's that simple, right? So I think it's all about, again, process and engagement.
And also I believe IT is such a, in many ways, such a new many organizations, it's a new job.
Yeah.
It's there's been accountants for decades, for centuries, but IT directors or
Yeah.
IT people, it's only been around for the last 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah.
So the perspective, the changing of the directors or the board who have, I have learned about Unix 20 years ago, hard thing to do.
Mhm.
That's my
Yeah.
vision on a certain
Yeah.
technology.
Yeah.
That change has to take place with the new generation when they're becoming directors, they understand it better.
I mean, the CIO is barely 30 years old as a profession, as a recognized rank in the
Yeah.
organization. And it's barely 10 years since CIOs have stopped reporting to CFOs, but post SOX, they've been reporting back to CFOs now.
It's very, very new.
Yeah, it is. You're right.
And I work in academia, it's even newer over there.
Oh, yeah. So do I. So do I, and it is. You're right. You're right. Yes.
I think I sit in executive committees, and then everybody in the room have no interest in talking about the IT system
Yeah.
because the CIO will talk about something that only he himself understands.
Yeah.
So how can we help him to speak of business system, business projects, rather than IT projects? That will help everybody in the room.
I think that's the key question. The how of it is again to explain to them that their job depends on it. No, it's really it's that simple. I mean, I use cases like Sydney Water. I mean, cases are powerful learning tools, and so even taking the board through an exercise like the Sydney Water case to show the link between something that went wrong in IT and something that went wrong in the business is a persuasive thing. My suggestion to you would be that your technical person needs to speak like a general manager. Needs to realize that they're a general manager. Training can help with that. And so one of the things, for example, in the MBA program that we do here is that we take technical people and they learn a general business language. And so that would be another route for you as well. But the other thing is, as a board or as an executive committee, if that person is wasting your time by speaking in a technical language, they should be told that until you can communicate with this committee, you're not going to communicate with this committee. Don't waste our time, because that's disrespectful of the committee, and he or she needs to understand that as well. And so a strong signal back from either the chair or the secretary to the executive committee, or the corporate secretary would probably suffice as well. Or, my suggestion, same thing as over here. You need a new technical person. They exist, Michael.
Well, I think, for the last 10 years, I've tried to get, it used to be that IT ran all the projects, and in the last 10 years, we've tried to change it so that IT doesn't run the project anymore. So the people that are communicating with the business are not necessarily the technology people.
Yeah.
They're the project people.
But that's not a satisfactory solution either. That's an intermediary step, because, ideally...
True. But I think at least it aligns the business issue that you have, which is and it goes a lot to what your banking example was with the woman that said we don't have IT projects, we have business projects.
Yeah.
That was at least one route, that if you have the project people, they can sort of identify what the project issue is.
Yeah, and if you have a project management office,
sometimes project people don't know about IT, so most of the time they have to be involved. Like my example.
I hope that's not the case. A lot of the project people did.
Sometimes project people are just running the project. They have no idea. I gave you the example.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, this is another issue. I'm willing to debate this for the next 3 hours.
It goes back to your question, because then people really need to understand it. The project manager is running the project, but ID has to be there to really convince and tell the people what exactly is needed and how it should be done. Because sometimes we just put the onus on project managers and hope that they understand what exactly is happening. It doesn't work that way, because one of the projects that I was involved in, it took 3 years for the project, and when you were saying after 3 years I don't know exactly that happened, and it's still today. I'm not with the organization, but I know it's not being implemented. So it's going to be like 4 and 5 years. But banks are still spending money on it, but they don't know if it's going to be done or not.
And ideally, if you have a project management office, you have both the project people and the technical people, irrespective of what the technology is, whether it's materials, whether it's a new plant, whether it's an IT system. You'll have the subject matter expert in your project management office or in the team.
I see you had, for example, number 3, which was of your 5 risks that you listed IT. project risk as one.
Yeah.
Your question 3B was, do you have professional project managers that oversee the projects, and are they schooled in some project manager book of knowledge? And so when I started in IT 20 years ago, we really didn't have project management offices. If the CIO title didn't exist 30 years ago, the project manager title didn't exist 11.
Yeah.
So it's only in about the last 10 years that we've put these sort of people into place. Is there any statistics that show that, because I want to say that I haven't seen a radical improvement in IT projects, even with these types of, I think things are better. At least we've got a project management office. It's not controlled, the project's not controlled by IT. These are good things. But a lot of the types of people that I saw move into project management early on were not technology people. They were the worst programmers that they might have gone through and gotten a computer science degree, but they saw this as their ticket. I can't sling code, so this is my ticket to a position in a company. And I'm going to go into the project management, route, and I'm going to go get this certification thing, and I'm going to take some test, and people are going to think that I can run these projects. And the reality is that I haven't seen, I think there's good project managers who have the certification, some don't. But are there any statistics you've seen that show that we're better today because of these things over the last 10 years than we were previously? In the 10 years before that? Because if that's the case, I'd like to see those, because I could maybe use them somewhere.
I'll tell you right away. In fact, they are there. My colleague Blaise Riche, the presentation tonight is from an article that Blaise and I did that was published in the California Management Review, which Amelia will also make available to you. But Blaise has done research with Chris Sauer at Oxford on exactly that question. They do have some statistics. I don't know them by heart, but they do, some of their studies have in fact showed that linkage. Okay. So the answer is we're better than we were 10 years ago. And you're right, we didn't have project managers 10, 15 years ago. We also didn't have the project management book of knowledge, and we also didn't have the emergence of a professional organization dedicated towards developing skills and abilities in that regard. So everything is new, and we've realized that there's value in having that discipline there, and their studies tend to bear that out. Now, Blaise and I will also argue about this, most IT projects fail. She's a bit looser on her definition of fail than I am. And so I tend to be morally very strict on that. And she allows for externalities, but the numbers are there. Yes?
One of the examples you gave was Sydney Water. And why did it fail? I mean, what was the main reason that it failed?
It's a great, the main reason that it failed, we don't know because it was settled out of court. The integrator in that case was PricewaterhouseCoopers. But the Auditor General for New South Wales did an audit of the project, and the Auditor General reported basically that it failed for two big reasons. One, management didn't do its job. And so the managing director was also the chair of the board, and so he had an executive chair. He, in this case, did not discharge his duties and did not fully inform the board and did not manage downwards into his organization to ensure successful delivery. Second thing that came out of it, and why it's such a landmark case, is the Auditor General also said clearly and unequivocally the board did not do its job. And so the Auditor General would say, for example, when that first $5 million variance came, there should have been controls put into place. When a second variance of $8 million came, there should have been controls put into place. When a third variance of $9 million came, the project should either have been suspended or stopped, or the board should have done something more than just rubber stamp that third variance. And so in this case, first thing is, if you go back into the technological side of it, what the subsequent audit found is that it was technically impossible to do what it is that they wanted to do. Nevertheless, it failed as a project. They could have scrapped the whole thing and started anew instead of trying to make all these things fit. So they could have achieved their objectives. But it failed because management and the board did not discharge its responsibilities.
It sounds to me, if it's something impossible project to begin with, that sounds like that there must be a company selling the idea that yes, you can do this. It sounds like a fraud. Rather than
Well, fortunately, I mean, first of all, PricewaterhouseCoopers, at least then, before it was sold to IBM Global Services, was a very reputable and very experienced organization. And so they were chosen after a competitive bidding process, and there's no reason to believe that they were fraudulent. We don't have the trial, we don't have the court case, because the parties countersued each other, and that's why it took until 2008, 2009 to play out. We don't have that record, and we don't have the discovery, so we can't say whether it was fraud or negligence. But, okay, what I will tell you, my opinion is that if you put your money on PricewaterhouseCoopers, who has done this countless times, and who has succeeded with projects where incredibly more complex and more detailed, versus Sydney Water, who has a history of not succeeding in IT projects, and who, this project was the largest project, I would say that the fault would tend to rest on the organization that doesn't have the expertise versus the organization that does. And the Auditor General's report would tend to support that. But as I say, we don't have public documents, at least, that tell us one way or the other.
What I'm having to put kind of linking the two is that what you just described sounds like the board failed to do what they needed to do, management failed to do what they needed to do. It could have been any project, not just IT project. So why is it this IT project failed? I mean, I'm having a tough time linking the IT project board and the management failing to do. It could have been any other project.
Because again, with the organization that you're dealing with, $500 million capital budget each year. And so this is an organization that puts in sewers, big water lines, pipes, desalination plants, water purification plants, and so the board is used to seeing projects. And so to the tune of $500 million a year. And this, in the scope of things was a $38 million project. And yet we're back to the glazed eyes. They didn't do their job because it was IT. Because they refused to engage with the fact that it was technology, and this was boring. It was a billing system. It wasn't putting a sewer in a new subdivision. It wasn't putting in a water main line in a new area of the city that had a higher concentration. And so because it was something very different from what they had done in the past, the board did not opt to educate itself or to engage with it.
But even so, I mean, public utilities company like that in the modern day, where 2000, I mean, they must have like computer monitoring system and all that kind of stuff, so they must be somewhat tech savvy compared to the other companies. Yet they fail at it. I can't really make the connection.
And this is the miracle or the bad miracle of information technology projects. And that's why I go back to most of them failing.
But I also feel at the end of the day, the management is not delivered properly to your IT company the exact requirements, and that goes back to the homework they've done internally. So the company is only going to deliver what you tell them they need. And if that comes, rather than a big picture initially, and I go back to the outcome comes down to management to do their job on this right. So my opinion would be that initial job, what the requirements they need to give out was probably never given right.
Yeah, but how much more do you need to tell you? We have a 12 different system.
We don't know.
60 different interface.
No,
we want it to be all one.
Well, that's the thing. The complexity of the system, none of us in this room know that.
Right.
It's only the people.
Well, I mean, that's what the professor told. So, what more do they need to know?
But the point is also there are different routes to taking that. So, for example, the choice of integrating versus scrapping and starting with a new system. One wonders why they didn't do that. And the answer is because the managing director didn't know any better and didn't push it down the organization. But you're quite right. I mean, integrators will work to their contract. Outsourcers will work to their service level agreements. And certainly, in the case of if there had been fraud, someone would have gone to jail. And the fact that no one has, it's an imprecise world. But I guess the one thing I can say, I mean, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've been in this industry for 25, 30 years almost. You see it time and again. You see good organizations make bad decisions when it comes to IT. And it's one of the persistent problems that we deal with as a field.
It's a huge communication gap over there. It's a huge communication gap because, go back to it, and I'm dealing with this a bit right now, because there are the powers above who want to make decisions because something I overheard somebody else did without fully understanding the actual scope of what's needed. It's not it's not IT. You can buy the boxes. At the end of the day, there are a lot of other people that business side of the organization drives it, to make it successful.
Yes.
Yes, have you heard of there's a case that I heard on IT. There's a big consultancy practice worldwide, and they use SAP as enterprise system.
Right.
Decided to go for it. And on the day after they implemented it, the company nearly went bankrupt.
Yeah.
Because the system did not alert the directors to issue fee bills.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they found that
Yeah.
they were strapped of cash because nobody was issuing any
Yeah.
fee invoices.
Yeah.
So a very small overlook
Yeah.
by implementing a big system with a big change in the organization might cause the whole organization to collapse.
Oh, yeah, yeah. A Canadian grocer, Sobeys, and I talked about this example in that article, they had an SAP implementation, and grocers work on razor-thin margins. You know, they spent about $80 million on it. They ended up taking about an $80 million write-down and scrapping the entire thing because they failed to take into account things like reconciling inventory, reconciling the point-of-sale system, the scanner system, with their stock system, with their accounts payable and accounts receivable. Again, simple things, and there are people that are paid a lot of money to do this, and then certainly the integrator in this case was paid a lot of multi-million dollars to do this and failed to do it. It's something that is endemic, and my suggestion is it's from the top down. Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
You will last.
Well, the company is getting involved in border management control systems, where probably everybody knows it's traveling. There has been a lot more technology involved nowadays to control people and passing immigrations.
Yeah.
When these government offices have to implement new systems, a lot of privacy law, a lot of international regulations, a lot of background checks, domestic and international blacklists have to be done when people cross the borders. Now, I was interested to hear from you whether there are any studies done with respect to success and failures of complex IT systems, where the complexity of border control management system of the latest status. I think the border system is more like an entrepreneurial side.
Yeah.
With lots of new technologies, I see that some countries really struggle with this kind of lots of with a multitude of this issue.
Yeah.
Now, these risks or this how do you call it, like the anatomy of failure. Is this the same for government departments? Are the suggestions you, are the pointers which people should look out for, are they also the same in government organizations like this? And the third part is, are there studies which show that there might be more success in business nowadays to implement such complex, more complicated IT projects versus in government departments?
Yeah. It's a lot of questions.
One
Yeah, we said it was one. I said
One
last question. Just make it a big one.
Yeah, that's right. The answer is yes and no. Okay, so let me go through. In terms of studies, there have been, there are very few. Some have been done by the OECD, others by large multinational consulting groups like Forrester and Gartner. But to your point on border systems and dealing with protection of information and privacy, no. And the reason for that is that because you're dealing with typically national jurisdictions, and each of these regulatory frameworks are different, it's hard to get a comparative study that looks across all of them. Okay, so that's, yes, it's there, but it's not, it's at a very high level. To your second point, in terms of the principles, research would suggest, and mine included in my opinion, is that these principles are the same. What might change is the salience. In your case, you're dealing with a much higher degree of risk from leakage and from information protection and from integrity of information. And so your disaster might not be time related so much as it is quality related, accuracy and completeness related. But the principles, I think, remain the same. They just take on a different salience that's unique to your particular situation. So I think, and then there was a third part. Did I miss the third, or did I get the third as well?
No.
Okay. Okay, good. So I would, encourage you to take a look at the OECD work.
Well, it was fascinating. I must say, though, that it reminded me of a board that I sit on, and we were putting in a new technology system, and I have to admit that sitting there, I was hoping that somebody else in the room understood what was going on, because I didn't have a clue. And the other thing it reminded me of is that the same system, the reason when we replaced it, we ran into a lot of problems because everybody is an expert now on technology. As you said, everybody feels they know a lot about technology, and we found people were putting new programs onto their computer because it would work better than the one that was going to be in there anyway, and didn't understand why this was affecting the overall system. So I think there was a lot of meat in that, Michael, and a lot of things that all of us could look at. So thank you very much for your expertise.
Thank you.